Hey, good evening, everybody. How are you? You showed up on Friday night for science class. Welcome to Nerd Club. Man. No, this is actually really cool. I get to do two of my absolute favorite subjects all in one, science and the Bible. A couple of things I want to promise you. This is science class-ish, so you got your desk, you got your paper, you got something to write on. But you don't have to take thorough notes for this. I'm going to give you a specific assignment. You can if you want to take notes on everything. But I'm going to tell you to write some specific things down. And I also want you to know that I will not be giving you 2 hours of solid science. This is not a full lecture. There's a reason that the tables sit facing each other, and I'll have some of you who are not at the tables. I'll tell you when we start. We're actually going to break several times through the night for a couple of reasons. One reason, I want you to be able to process a little bit. I do not want this to be fire hose science class where it all just keeps coming and coming, and pretty soon you start dumping information when that happens. Your brain's like, I'm full, I'm done. That's it. I'll just pretend to keep writing. So I don't want to do that. We're going to break, and when we break at the tables, we're going to, or even if you're not at a table, you're sitting somewhere, I want you to come up with your questions. Our last session is going to be question and answer. I am not going to answer all your questions. I am not going to be able to explain everything about science and everything about the Bible in a couple hours. It doesn't work that way. What I do want to give you is some basic keys and building blocks to approach the whole thing. The other thing I don't want to do is give a bunch of science over your head. I'm going to aim this to explain where all of you can understand. And if you don't understand, then write down some of those questions as you go, and we'll answer that when we're done. If you find me going on and you're just lost, then raise your hand, throw a spitwad at me or something like that. I taught 7th and 8th grade at an all-boys school, so I can handle it. So. With all that said, we're actually going to start in Genesis 1:1. If you have a Bible, then you can open it. If you don't have a Bible, I have a great app for you. You can go to the App Store right now and type through the word. And you can, right now you have it. Extra points for the front row. We're going to start in Genesis 1:1, and I'm going to pray before we start. I'm also going to set myself a timer. Lord, we thank you for calling us together this evening. We invite you into our midst. We ask that you would speak to us. Lord, help us to know and understand. Help us to learn. Help us to grow in faith and understanding. We invite you to be our teacher this evening, and we pray in Jesus' name. And everyone said, Amen. Genesis 1:1. Dios en el principio creó los cielos y la tierra. All right, well, I'm going to actually try to preach in Spanish on Sunday morning. So come back on Sunday morning and see if I can pull it off. But tonight we're just going to be in English. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Okay, class is in session. The first thing I want you to write on your paper, if you've got a paper. If you don't have a paper, just scramble or write it. First thing I want you to write is verse 1. Across the top of your paper, just write down verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, one of the things I decided not to do tonight was have a bunch of overheads. And I really thought, it'd be great if I had overheads with really fancy science stuff to impress you and help it all make sense. But I really want you to walk away from this feeling like you could sit down and have a conversation with somebody kind of like what we're doing without a bunch of fancy overheads. I don't want you to walk away saying, man, I wish I had those slides. I could show you all this cool stuff about science that Pastor Kris showed. I want to meet you right where you're at, and we're just going to have a discussion, talk one-on-one. We're going to talk some basics of science. Now, with verse 1, my question is, does new science contradict a very old Bible? 2005, the Kansas State Board of Education held hearings to consider a proposal to change how evolution and the origin of life would be taught in the state's public high school science classes, with the intent of introducing intelligent design into science classes. So, Kansas State Board, there are some folks on the school board who want to teach intelligent design in science class. Well, as you can imagine, this caused quite a big hubbub, and a lot of people fought and complained. Well, they pushed it through, and initially it was actually passed. In 2005, Kansas schools began teaching intelligent design alongside of evolution. It was the standard for more than a year. Of course, it was challenged, and the challenge to teaching intelligent design, which is basically stating that the evidence of creation around us demonstrates that there is an intelligent designer, i.e. God, without saying the word God. The challenge to that, as if you look at the Wikipedia article about it, says this: the scientific community rejects teaching intelligent design as science. Leading example being the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which issued a policy statement saying, creationism, intelligent design, and other claims of supernatural intervention in the origin of life or of species are not science because they are not testable by the methods of science. Okay, that was big sciencey talk. Let me translate that for you. What they're saying is you can't teach God in a science class because God can't be tested. And science is all about testing and proving. So if God can't be tested or proven by the methods of science, they said we're going to keep him out of the science class. They weren't stating that God doesn't exist. They were just stating that talking about God doesn't belong in science class. And it is a very good point. I mean, if you think about that, that's pretty logical. And the challenge succeeded. February 13th, 2007, the Kansas Board of Education voted 6-4 to reject the amended science standards that had been previously enacted. The Wikipedia article says that the definition of science was once again returned to the search for natural explanations of what is observed in the universe. The search for natural explanations rather than supernatural. So they keep God out of science because it's supernatural. It's not atheism necessarily. They're not saying there isn't a God. They're just saying it's not natural, where science studies the natural, what we find in nature. Now, the school board had previously, as they were trying to teach intelligent design, they weren't particularly trying to teach the Bible as science, but let's just say we did. Look back at what you wrote down on your paper. What do you have in front of you, if you're all good students? What did you write down? In the beginning, God. Okay, stop right there. In the beginning, God. Well, if we're going to go along with that argument that God is not provable scientifically, your Bible's already out on word 4. In fact, if you listen as I was reading it in Spanish, you'd be out on word 1, because in Spanish it starts with Dios. So I guess we're going to set the Bible aside for a moment and just kind of concede, okay, they made a pretty decent argument. You can't scientifically prove God, so maybe it doesn't belong in science class. And they went back to where they were, which was teaching evolution. So let's consider evolution for a moment. Now, I want to start this out by stating from the beginning, I do not intend to disprove evolution this evening. That's not what I'm about. I may challenge some individual tenets of the larger evolutionary theory, and if I challenge them, I'm going to apply science to do so. I am not going to play a game of the Bible versus evolution. But I'll clue you in early that I actually believe that there are significant parts of evolution that have strong scientific evidence. And I think they're pretty amazing. Evolution is pretty incredible stuff. And a lot of what is shown in schools, evidence of evolution, is pretty amazing. And they show you a lot of evidence. I mean, they spend a lot of time on it. If you make your way through high school and college, they spend a lot of time on evolution. It seems like they got a lot of stuff on there. But I do take issue with some elements of the evolution theory as it is taught in school. You have to understand there are many versions of the evolutionary theory. There's not just one set, this is evolution. And there are many parts to the evolution theory. It's a very big thing. It's the idea of how life progressed through the history of time. For tonight, we're going to focus on the evolution that you probably learn in public school. And let's consider it using science. Okay, we're going to think about evolution for a second, and you got to get your pencils ready. Evolution has 3 basic ingredients. As you're taught in school, Darwinian evolution, I want you to write evolution equals. And I'm going to tell you the 3 basic ingredients, and we're going to consider them. Evolution equals random mutation. I know we're getting big words here. Evolution equals random mutation plus natural selection plus time. Think about that for a second. Evolution equals random mutation plus natural selection plus time. Is that approximately how evolution is taught to you in school? These are the 3 basics. Yeah, there's a lot of inner details, but this is the big stuff. And in school, evidence is offered for each of these ingredients. You spend a lot of time on it. First, they offer evidence of mutation, observing bacteria changes by generation, adapting and strengthening against various antibiotics. We all hear about bacteria and use your antibacterial, and there's antibiotics, and we hear very often from the scientific community, from the medical community, that bacteria can adapt, and that's mutation. We also hear, of course, of dog breeds. I like to talk about dog breeds in science class, and the dogs changing over time for selective things that the breeders, various traits that breeders were selecting. And of course, Darwin's famous finches. Now, so there's all their evidence for mutation. Natural selection. Well, the idea of natural selection is fairly reasonable and just somewhat observable. The survival of the fittest, right? The fittest carry on, and they have more kids for another generation of whatever species they are. And so naturally, the best traits are selected. And time. Now, the question of time, this is where Christians focus most of their arguments. If you've actually gone online and looked for science in the Bible stuff and tried to dig in, a lot of the argument focuses on the matter of time, whether the history of the universe is long or short. I want to warn you just a little bit that it is a very heady and deep argument. And you will, if you try to dig into it, if you know some science, it's pretty fascinating stuff, but you will find yourself considering elements of the speed of light and arguments over the stability of the speed of light and the directionality of the speed of light. You're going to be digging into questions of geology, and time is a tough argument, and I personally think it's a mistake for Christians to camp our argument there, because I think we're missing something obvious. On the time argument, most non-Christians would say that the universe is very old, exceedingly old, billions of years old. Christians, on the other hand, take both sides. There are some Christians who say that the universe is quite young, and you'll often hear about 6,000 years coming from the Bible as a source text scientifically for it. They'll say 6,000 years. But other Christians will say the word 6,000 years never appears in the Bible. It can be added up from some genealogical numbers. But the Christians who believe in an older earth and an older universe will point out that the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1, each of those days, the word day in Hebrew is yom, they'll say each of those days could be a very long period of time. The word day in other places is used for era or age, as in when somebody says back in my day, I don't mean like Wednesday last week. When I say back in my day, I mean like the days when I was cool. It was actually about 24 hours, but it was. But a day could be an age. So some Christians, Bible-believing, strong, intelligent, smart Christians will believe the universe is very old. And generally that argument is really a science one that has a lot of depth to it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. I would encourage you that if you get into an argument or a discussion, hopefully a friendly discussion over evolution, creation, all this stuff, that you not get lost in that part of the debate. Because I'm okay either way. I honestly, I'll tell you, I've considered both ways. There are times where I thought, I'm young Earth, I'm on it. And other times where I saw some evidence like, actually, I think I'm going back to old Earth. And then other times, as a scientist, I've thought to myself, I could work either way. Both times, I'm still good with the Bible. But I'm not going to get into that part of the debate. So we covered the elements of evolution. I want you to look back at your paper and the ingredients for evolution. We gave evidence for mutation. We gave evidence of natural selection. We gave evidence of time. Did I miss anything? I think we're actually missing the most important and most obvious one. What was the very first word I had you write down? Random. Random mutation. Did you know it is scientifically impossible to prove that any given event is random? Did you know that? It cannot be proven. If you see a sequence of numbers, it may look random to you, 3.1415297. But that's not a random number, that's pi. You may hear a random bunch of sounds, beep, bop, boop, beep. You think, oh, that was random, but maybe that was the code to get into my computer, and I just gave it away. You don't know, and you can't prove whether or not something is random. Now, this is kind of interesting. Remember the Kansas School Board argument. They said God is not testable or provable by science, therefore out of science class. After all, the first word in the Bible is God. Push that out of the science class because the very first word violates our rules. You can't prove it. Wait a second. How did evolution get in? The very first word, random, cannot be proven by science. Do different rules apply? Now, that does not mean that random is not a scientific thing. Random is actually extremely useful in science, especially if you're in statistics class. Randomness, chaos theory, random is very important to science, but you can't prove that it exists or that any particular thing is random. In other words, when mutations are observed, when I prefer to call them adaptations, because mutation makes them sound more random, when mutations are observed, when dogs become other dogs, when bacteria become other bacteria, we cannot prove scientifically that that happened by random chance. We don't know. And this is interesting because the reality is, in the question of the Bible versus evolution, there is just one part that I really take issue with. Mutations, I prefer the term adaptations, but the basic concept is solid and the Bible is fine with it. The Bible tells us about God creating certain kinds or species, you might say, but the Bible has no issue whatsoever from those kinds adapting to become others. God may have made just 2 canines, and the canines could have become all the wolves and dogs and all the chihuahuas. I don't know why. But the golden retrievers, that was a high point. And the Bible has no problem with any of that. In fact, the Bible really doesn't take any issue against particular elements of evolution that may have been taught. You may agree or disagree on scientific matters, but biblically you're okay except for one, which is monkeys becoming humans. And there are some Christians who will say, you know, maybe the Bible can still fit that, monkeys becoming humans. But I think it's an unnecessary argument because there is not scientific evidence. We don't have a line where we can show this monkey became this monkey, became this monkey, became this human. And there's a lot of issues with that as well. But adaptations were fine. Survival of the fittest. The Bible doesn't say anything against it in the animal world, but it does command humans to protect and provide for the weak, which in the past, when evolution was becoming very popular 100 years ago, pitted Christianity in strong opposition to something called eugenics. Eugenics was an application of survival of the fittest and evolutionary theory to humans specifically, and it's the stuff that Hitler and others used as their reasoning, their scientific reasoning, to explain to their people that some people are lesser, and therefore, because of survival of the fittest, to protect the species, we should do away with them. Most of us gut reaction to that is it's just wrong. What is our basis of it's wrong? Our basis for us is the Bible. The Bible says protect the weak, provide for the poor. So survival of the fittest, well, it might happen in the animal kingdom, but for humans, it's dangerous stuff. And even most atheists would agree with that, most. And the time issue, again, this is a very thick debate, and someone very good at science can easily out-talk most of us on either side of it. However, the Bible can match a young or an old theory. Some would argue with me on that. There's some people who are big on creation theory who might stand up and walk out right now, like the little 2-year-old right now. He's a young earther. He's like, "Argh." Now, the problem is that most of the debates that we hold with people end up with smart people on both sides volleying arguments way over our heads. I tend not to get involved in those. Most of us end up just voting on whoever sounds the smartest. You ever been through that where like two people are talking, you're like, well, that guy seems smarter. Or actually the way I go is whoever seems less arrogant about it. I'll take that one. I can't tell who's right, but that guy's stuck up. So I'm going with her. Warning, a lot of people listen to Christians arguing with atheists about it, and a lot of times the Christian is the one who sounds the most arrogant. I remember going into a debate, it was a big community college hosted debate, it was a public community college hosted debate between a Christian, creationist, and a local scientist who was an evolutionist. And our church actually helped set it up, and I was so disappointed because I sat there the whole time, and I'd studied engineering stuff. I followed most of it. I looked around. I could tell a lot of people weren't following a lot of the debate, but the one thing that anybody could pick up was that the Christian was rude. And the evolution guy was actually pretty nice. He didn't know his science, he didn't know that particular stuff quite as well. The Christian guy was so prepared to knock down every argument, take him down. But the Bible says that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So, in school, what happens? Well, in school, they tend to present lots of evidence for mutations. Evidence, evidence, evidence. Survival of the fittest. Evidence, evidence, evidence. Billions of years. Evidence, evidence, evidence. More and more evidence. And it kind of just overwhelms you like, I guess there's a lot of evidence for evolution. And on those matters, there is significant evidence. Some would argue it, but there is evidence to be presented. But pay close attention in school. Do they ever once offer evidence that all this stuff happening is random? Ask your teacher. Okay, I've seen a lot of evidence for all this stuff. How do you know that's random? Is there any way to prove it? That all those amazing changes that you're talking about, how do you know that happened by accident? And you can have a theory of evolution without random. Many people do. And for me, it would be a much more sensible and verifiable theory, but it would also indicate purpose. If it's not random, the other alternative is purpose. And adaptation would be the better word rather than mutation. And it would force the question, where did the purpose come from? Also to point out, the evolutionary theory does not offer an explanation of how nothing became something. That's not evolution. How something became life, also not evolution. It only attempts to explain how simple life became more complex life. We're actually going to come back to that in our next session. So the question is, do we have good scientific explanations for those other elements? All right, I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to come back to it in the next session. There is no explanation of the universe using the laws of nature alone that does not violate the very same laws of nature. There is no explanation of the universe that only uses the laws of nature that doesn't in turn violate the laws of nature. I'm going to explain that in session 2. But first, I want to introduce myself and our approach. All right, back off the science for a moment. First, you need to know who I am. If you're going to listen to anybody, you got to know what their credentials are to talk to you. What are my qualifications to speak to you on this topic? Well, Marcel introduced me. I'm Kris Langham. I'm a pastor. A bunch of you know me from Through the Word. I'll talk more about Through the Word on Sunday. Actually, before I was a believer, I was working on my Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering at University of California, San Diego. It's one of the top 10 engineering schools in the country on various charts. I graduated with honors. Once I was done with that, I helped design rockets for Boeing. I got a job. We put Delta rockets into space, put satellites up there, and no, the rockets did not run on faith. They ran on rocket fuel, surprisingly enough. Actually, it was really interesting when I graduated. I was a brand new Christian, and a big thing that brought me to the Lord, I had rejected Christianity for years in school, and the excuse that I used, I didn't call it an excuse, but it was an excuse. The excuse that I used was, I called it agnostic, which is, I don't know, nobody knows, nobody can prove God. I essentially used the Kansas School Board statement, you can't prove God, and said, I'm a man of science, so that's where I land. I finally thought to myself, I've never attempted to prove God, so how do I know that you can't? I haven't really gone about this scientifically at all. And so, when that dawned upon me, I said to God, if you're there, I don't know, I'm listening. Where do I start? I happened to start the Bible. The Bible is a little confusing, but somebody actually, I stumbled across on the radio, somebody explaining Bible and science, and I was blown away. I'd never heard this stuff before. I'd never heard anybody challenge evolution. I didn't know that people existed that had any issue at all with evolution. I heard some pretty incredible stuff about the Bible. Now, that's who I was. And I'll say this, just a little side from who I was, all that impressive rocket science stuff. As cool as that sounds, I'm dumber than I look. And I mean that. When people hear rocket science, oh, wow. I got a bachelor's degree. I was an engineer. I was a regular everyday engineer. I didn't invent rockets. I wasn't Werner von Braun. I worked on rockets. It was cool. I was intelligent. But the reality is, and the irony is, my intelligence was actually the thing that kept me away from God. Not because I was so smart that I could prove God wrong, but because my intelligence created pride. My intelligence became an idol, a replacement for God. The reality is there are people smarter than me or you on both sides of the debate over God and creation and intelligent design. It's not just about how smart you are. And it wasn't until I humbled myself. It wasn't a matter of finally getting the right facts and science. It was a matter of humility. It was humility when I realized that I don't have all the answers and I don't know everything. And when I finally humbled myself. Really interesting, when I arrived at Boeing, my first job at Boeing, I was brand new Christian, so I put a Jesus fish outside my cubicle and he was eating a Darwin fish, like, argh. And I was putting it out like, I'm a rebel scientist. Take that, all you atheists. My boss came next door and he looked at it and he looked at me. He's like, hey, Kris, I didn't know you were a Christian. Hey, Mike, Kris is a Christian. You want to go to Bible study? And my whole crew, like I had like 15 guys on my team on the control systems that we worked on. Like at least 12 of them went to Bible study every week during lunch break. We had a huge Bible study at Boeing. It's actually really interesting. Some studies have been done. Engineers and people who work on machines are actually less likely to believe in evolutionary theory because it just seems to violate everything we got taught in science. There's a kind of a general question that rumbles inside you when you study machines that keeps asking if evolution creates the greatest machines in the whole world. Absolutely. The simplest living cell blows away the space station by a long shot. The simplest cell known to humanity. If evolution is the greatest creator of machines, why do we not spend a single day learning how to apply evolution to engineering or evolution to software design? Why don't we just evolve things? And we could. If you just design a code and make random changes to your code and just keep testing them, provide some kind of test, create a survival of the fittest in your computer, you could create a better software design using evolution, but nobody does. Why has nobody thought? The greatest machines in the world are made this way. With modern supercomputers, it would be easy to do, but nobody does because random doesn't help. Okay, we'll get back to that later. Now, what are my disqualifications? First of all, I'm not a PhD. I'm also not a biologist. I'm not a lot of things that you might want and somebody come and speak to you about origin of life and stuff like that. I'm not the smartest person in the world. There are people much smarter than me that disagree with me. They're smarter than me that agree with me. In this debate, we can't just play the smartest person wins. It doesn't work like that. You don't get out of the debate by just saying, well, he sounded smart. What I am good at is explaining stuff at your level. This is actually my main gift. I explain. I'm a tutor. I work with high school kids and on a regular basis, and I explain science, I explain chemistry and physics. I'm not a master of all these things, but I'm good at explaining. So that's what I really want to do tonight, just explain what the central arguments are here so you can grab a hold of it. I don't have all the answers, but I do understand what the basic questions are so I can help you form those so you can kind of be informed how to take on this argument. You ever listen to a creation debate and feel like you're a kid playing monkey in the middle with giants? Like there's intelligence giants on both sides. You're just like volleying the ball over. You're like, hey, I can't reach that. Hey, I'm not that tall. I'm not going to do that to you. The reality is a lot of those intelligent arguments hide behind big words and conceal the fact that we don't have complete answers on either side. There is neither side to the origin debate that just answers everything for you. The Bible does not offer every answer to science. Neither does evolution. There's a lot of huge gaps that nobody has explained. We as Christians tend to say, well, I guess God did that. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the thing. It's just the easiest answer for us. Or this place in the Bible says, well, yeah, God did do that. But nobody has all the answers. Our topic is not science versus the Bible. Our topic is science and the Bible. You got to understand that science versus the Bible would be a false comparison. They're two different concepts. It would be like xylophones versus sense of humor. Right? Xylophones up against sense of humor. Which one's going to win? Well, you might use your sense of humor to understand a xylophone because it's a little goofy. But you don't compare them. You might use science to apply it to the Bible, but they're not coming against each other. The Bible is not a book of science. It is a collected set of writings of various kinds, some history, some poetry, prophecy, wisdom, law, theology, personal letters. As Christians, we hold them all to be God-breathed. So we believe that the Bible is a book of truth. Science is not a collected set of truths. Science is a methodology by which you can examine claims of truth. So the way we go about this is not science versus the Bible. We use science to examine the Bible and say, all right, does this match up scientifically? We use science to examine evolution and say, how does this match up with the scientific method? But science is not our enemy. Science is just a method to approach these. So it's not the Bible claims this and science claims that. The Bible claims one thing, and some scientists or school might claim some other thing, and we're going to use science to examine them both. So this is our approach. We're going to start with some observations and some basic laws of science, and we're going to take a look at the basic claims. Now, we're going to take a break, because your brain is probably feeling about full, so we're going to take a quick break. And the tables are mostly full, but if you're sitting around the sides, here's what we're going to do with our breaks. They're going to be quick. And as a group, if the table's too big to have a discussion, just kind of get 4 of you together. And what I want you to come up with, collaborate on is this. 2 things. Every time we take a break, 2 quick things. First, what was the most useful thing you learned in this session? What's the most useful thing you learned? Collaborate, think, what was the most useful thing you learned? Second, what's the most important question you like to ask to follow up? All right, so get about 3 or 4 of you together and somebody write down, take the lead. What's the most useful thing you learned, so you don't forget it? And 2, what's the most important question you want to ask? I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to figure those things out, and I'm coming back. All right, time is up. Time is up. Don't worry if you didn't get all your questions and answers down. Hope you got a good start on it. One of the things I really want to do for you with this is equip you to have a conversation about it. There's a reason we're taking a break and talking about it, because this should not be something that you just go listen to smart people about. It should be something you can talk up to each other about. But I will point out that I'm now wearing glasses. And if you'd write on your paper, glasses plus bald equals smart. Now, you don't have to write that. Everyone knows that innately. I do actually need these for reading, but I put it in large print, so I'm okay, because I can't see you when I got them on. Okay, let's come back to it. This is part 2. We're going to talk origins and evolution, how we got here, and the laws of science. This is about how we got here, and specifically about the laws of science that we know. Now, in this session, I intend to demonstrate that there is no explanation of the universe using the laws of nature alone that does not violate those very same laws of nature. All right, I'm going to say that again, so if you missed some of it. But there is no explanation of the universe using the laws of nature alone that does not violate the very same laws of nature. Okay, interesting. Let's go back to the Kansas School Board. After they went back and forth, when they decided to kick intelligent design out and they went back to evolution only, they defined science this way. Science is the search for natural explanations for what is observed in the universe. So science class, you're looking for a natural explanation for the things we observe, everything we see around us. What do we see around us in the universe? We see a whole lot of amazing. I don't know if you've noticed that, but you take a look around, you also see a lot of difficult, you see a lot of pain. I'm certainly not going to deny that. There's a whole lot of hurt. But take a look around anywhere, and there's also a great deal of amazing. So how do we explain it with just natural explanations? Now, I'm sure they specifically intended when they said natural that God is out, because God is supernatural. So let's use nature, and we'll specifically address the question: is there a scientific theory that offers a valid explanation of the universe without God? In other words, can science explain a godless universe? Because a lot of people will tell you that, and the atheists will certainly push that. Hey, there's a version of understanding everything that doesn't require God, and it's a lot easier this way. Is that true? Are they right? So here's what I want you to write on your paper this time. For this round, I want you to write how we got here. How we got here. And then you need some space from side to side. So if you almost filled up your page, you might want to turn it over. You need space from one side of the page to the other. On the far right, I want you to write the word now. On the far left, I want you to write the word, oh wait, that's your right. Far right, right now, on the far left, I want you to write the word nothing. We're going to figure out how to get from nothing to now, but you need space in between, because a few things have to happen to get from nothing to now. Now, you might ask, well, why does it have to start from nothing? What if the universe is eternal? What if it's just always been? And for a long time, it's interesting, Christians, Bible believers, have always believed that the universe had a beginning, that there was in the beginning. That's right back Genesis 1. But for a long time, some scientists who rejected the Bible and such said the universe is simply eternal. It's always been here. So we have all the time in the universe to have accidentally landed it now. However, the problem with that is this. Picture time as a number line, which you do that in school, right? Picture time as a number line. I want you to start at negative infinity and start counting and tell me when you're going to arrive at 2019. If you start at negative infinity, when will you arrive at 2019? It can never, ever happen. If negative infinity exists, if time is eternal, now is impossible. Time cannot be infinite. It can't, or now can't exist. It's a logical impossibility. So time must have had a beginning. Now, scientists have actually caught up with that and come up with the Big Bang and said there's a beginning. But let's just put out the major blocks that have to happen between nothing and now. In between, you only need two major things. Now, there's a lot of steps in between. I want you to go from nothing, an arrow, and write the word universe. All the stuff. Nothing, arrow, universe. From universe, there's a lot of stuff that has to happen, but the most important one I want to consider, I want you to write universe, arrow, life. Of all the steps that happen, solar system, galaxies, rocks, earth, water, everything, all crazy stuff that has to happen, the biggest one of all is when the universe creates life. And then we'll just go from there, from life, arrow, now. So you should have 4 words on there with arrows in between. Nothing, universe, life, and now. The big question to explain is the arrows. How did the arrows get there? For the most part, if you listen to a secular, without adding God in there, explanation, the biggest thing they focus on is a lot of time. If you just stretch it out with a lot more time, and in my lifetime, the universe has gotten several billion years older, which makes me very old. But according to the scientific community, the universe just seems to keep getting older. Well, the arrows is what we need to explain. It's the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the progression of first life until now. So our question again, does science offer a theory or valid explanation for the universe as it is without God? Let's start with the first one. Look at the first arrow on there. We need to get from what to what? What's our first arrow? Oh, you are good students. All right, gold star for somebody. Nothing to the universe. What do we need? What needs to be in place to go from nothing to the universe? What basic elements do there need to be? Well, you need time. I want you to write this under that arrow, right underneath that arrow. You need time to start existing. Time has to come from somewhere. Time is a basic unit that all of the universes we know it exists within. So you need time. What else do you need for the universe? You need space and matter. I heard both of them. Man, 2 gold stars. We need time, space, and matter in order to have the universe existing as we know it. All right? Now, the question is, does science, the laws of science, offer an explanation how no time becomes time or no matter becomes matter or no space becomes space? No. There is no explanation whatsoever. School does not offer an explanation. Scientists do not offer an explanation. In fact, it directly violates the conservation of mass. This is one of the basic building blocks of science. Stuff doesn't come from non-stuff. Conservation of mass. Mass changes form, it changes what compounds it is, it changes location, but conservation of mass says stuff cannot come from not stuff. So we have violated a key law of science. Now, there's not a specific law of science that I can point to that says time can't come from not time or space can't come from not space, but those are kind of challenging as well. And once again, science does not offer an explanation where it came from. The really interesting thing about the Big Bang Theory, the way I see the Big Bang Theory, as Christians, instead of arguing against it, we should actually point out that the Big Bang Theory is actually a lot closer to the Bible's version than where scientists were. They've actually come a long way closer to where we're at. They've recognized there has to be a beginning. What the Big Bang Theory does is take all the problems and shove them into one tiny little dot and one tiny little moment, and so that scientists can say, I don't know what happened before this, but everything else I got a complete explanation. But this, I'm only wrong for 1 second. And seconds didn't even exist. So am I really that wrong? I'm just a tiny bit wrong. It's so small. You can't fault me for that. That's really kind of what the Big Bang does. Okay. So does science offer a theory? Does science offer a valid explanation? Well, no. But we're close. All we need is an explanation for 3 things: time, space, and matter. That can't be that big a deal. We're really close. The next one, what's our next arrow? Where are we going from? Universe to life. What do we need in order for the universe to create life? What are some basics that life absolutely has to have? What do you learn in your biology class, in your science class? What does life function on? It functions on sunlight, right? What does sunlight provide for it? Energy. You've got to have energy. Write down energy underneath that arrow. In order to get to life, there has to be energy. Life doesn't exist without it. There's something else that life absolutely needs. Water. There are theories that maybe water doesn't exist, but we're going to give water as part of mass. That's a good point. We usually look for water when we're looking for evidence of life, and you generally need carbon for life to exist, but I'm not going to get into those details. There's one really basic element that all life has, and that is order. All of life is orderly. So right underneath the arrow, you've got energy and you need order. Everything in life is machines, the most incredible machines in the universe. If you like machines, if you like stuff, man, take a look at a cell. Look up a YouTube on what happens inside a cell. It will blow your mind. So life needs energy and order. Now, okay, so does science offer explanations where energy and order came from? Let's consider the basic laws of science. What law of science do you know about energy? Conservation of energy says energy cannot be created or destroyed. Okay, so if we had to start at nothing, how do we get to energy? If it can't be created or destroyed, basic building block science, where did the energy come from? Science does not offer an answer in and of itself. How about order? Are there any, now we're getting into more difficult laws of science, but are there any laws of science that have to do with order? Entropy. Now this is high school level, but entropy is a measurement of randomness. Entropy, it's the second law of thermodynamics. It's absolutely proven, agreed upon. All scientists, Christian, atheists, everybody agrees. Second law of thermodynamics there's never been a case where it didn't work. What it says is, in a closed system, you got a box and nothing gets in, nothing gets out, the stuff inside that box will fall apart. It will always go from order to randomness. If you leave a house out in a field and you don't care for it, it'll fall apart. If you leave a garden and you don't care for it, it'll get worse. When you leave something, it always goes from order to randomness. Law of science, we've never seen anything that disproves it or does differently. Order does not come from disorder. It can't. Law of science. Disorder can come from order. It goes the other way. In science, it's called increasing entropy, increasing randomness. So there's only two things we need for this arrow, energy and order. Does science offer an explanation? No. In fact, we have violated two very important laws of science: conservation of energy and second law of thermodynamics. In science class, it kind of goes like this. This is what I got in college science. They're really intelligent professors. In college science, college biology, it was basically presented to me, here's a lot of physics, how stuff works, and forces, and, things, gravity and things moving around, and electricity. And then here's chemistry class. Chemicals do all these incredible things. When you mix them, explosions, colors, everything happens, cool chemicals. And basically what was presented to me when I got to biology class was physics plus chemistry equals biology. Is that true? Is that kind of what you got? If you got enough physics and biology together, if you just put the laws together, stuff's just naturally life, biology. Are we missing anything? Is it just physics and chemistry? What's missing? One of the kids here, science girl. What's your name? Hannah, you had a drawing of something when you walked in. What did you have a drawing of? 3 letters. DNA. DNA is the basic building block of life. Is DNA just physics and chemistry? Is there anything else that makes it run? Yeah, is it randomness? It doesn't look very random. It looks pretty orderly to me. DNA is extremely orderly. I heard something over here. Information. Do you know that DNA works on code? It is coded. It is exactly like a software code. There's 4 little letters. The letters are A, C, G, and T. They represent adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. And the sequences of code, sequences of those letters, have meaning, and that meaning determines what color your eyes are, and what color your hair is, and whether or not you have any at a certain age. And it also determines the complete design of your heart and every blood cell and your skin cells and the communication system between your brain and the rest of your body and the incredible things that your body does every second. Absolutely incredible. When you look around, you know all the colors you see? You know why you see color? You see color because light works in different wavelengths. All the different colors of the lights up here, all those colors are different wavelengths of light. Well, how does your eye know the difference? Or how does your brain know the difference? Well, the only way that we can simulate that on a computer is calculus. It's a form of calculus called differential equations, to figure out the wavelength of every different light and figure out what those colors are. The cells in your eye, there's nerve cells in your eye that take in light. Now, light travels so fast it would go around the world 7 times in a second, 300 million meters per second. And all the light, all those little photons traveling and hitting your eye goes so fast, and all the different wavelengths, there's tiny different, like a wavelength is this thing. And some of them are shorter wavelengths, some are longer wavelengths. That tells you whether it's blue or red or green. The cells in your eye convert the information about the length of wavelengths hitting from every direction and send your brain an electronic signal that tells it what color it's seeing from what direction. The only way we know how to do that is calculus, and the speed at which a single cell in your eye does that calculus is as fast as a supercomputer or faster. And the ability to do that as a computer, the little cell in your eye, is built into every DNA single molecule in your body. That ability to design a cell to do that computing is built into every DNA in your body, along with some extra code that decides whether this particular cell is going to be a nerve cell or a part of a lung or a red blood cell or every other amazing thing in your body. It's all coded in there. Life requires physics, yes, chemistry, yes, but also requires code. And the question is, how do you get code from nothing? Can code be accidental? Can language just happen? The evolutionary idea is, well, you get the amino acids, and they've got some really loose science saying the amino acid could happen by accident, the little letters that are on the DNA. And once they accidentally fell in the right sequence, it created the rest of the cell and told it to do this and that. How did it know to do it? The idea of code happening accidentally would be like me taking a bunch of ink and throwing it at the wall, and the letters say a word. Now, how many times do I have to throw that ink? Well, eventually, it might look like an R, right? Or an S, but what if words didn't exist? How many times would I have to throw ink against a wall or a bunch of Scrabble? What did it say you already have the letters? A bunch of Scrabble letters, mix them up. How many times do I mix those Scrabble letters before you get a word in a language that doesn't exist? A lot of times? A bazillion times? It never, ever happens. You can't get code from non-code. So we need three things on this arrow: energy, order, and code, or information or language, whichever one you want to write. So how does that happen? Does science provide a viable explanation? No, but we're really close. All we need is three more things: energy, order, and code. Now we got 6 so far. You should have 6 so far. Time, space, matter, energy, order, and code. That last arrow is life progressing until now. This is the only part that evolution actually attempts to explain, your last arrow. I'm going to just, because we don't have a lot of time, let's just say evolution could do that. I think it's ridiculous. It violates the second law of thermodynamics. But let's say evolution, adaptations could do that whole part to get from life up till now, and ignore that for a second. Has science answered these other 6 needs? Does science provide a viable explanation of how things are? No, but we're really close. Time, space, matter, energy, order, and code. That's all we need, and we got this hooked, and we don't need God. Now, I want you to go back to Genesis 1:1 and take a look at something. And we're going to take a break right after this. I know your brain's full again. We're going to take another break. Okay, let's try this in the Bible. Since science is not answering all our questions, and in fact, the laws of nature insist that the laws of nature be broken, does the Bible offer anything to help with this? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, interesting. In the beginning. What does beginning mean? It means the start of time. Right out the bat, we got an answer for that one. God created. Interesting, the word created in Hebrew there does not mean like taking a bunch of parts and making a machine. The Hebrew word created there means to make something from nothing. In other words, the very first verse explains that God made something from nothing. Isn't that the one thing we needed to fill in the big hole that science left us? He created the heavens. Guess what heavens are? Space. And the earth. Guess what earth is? Matter. We got the first 3 in the first verse. Could that be a coincidence? Maybe so. It's a pretty big one. Moses, 3,000 years ago or so, happens to get 3 in one verse. Happens to know the questions of modern science for us today and the holes that still have not been filled in by science. No one, anywhere, scientifically has given an explanation for where those came from. Oh, let's try the next verse. See how we're doing. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Again, Christians go into a lot of rigmarole about what all that means scientifically. I'm not going to get into that right now. And God said, wait, verse 3, God said, what happens when somebody says something? It's language or code. We got another one. God said, let there be light. What is light? We're rolling. Let there be light. And there was light. What's the last one we need? We can't possibly get all of them this easy. What's the last one we need? All we need is order. Verse 4, God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Guess what separating creates? Order. I'm 4 verses in, and I have answered every problem that science poses to us that no scientist has ever offered any answer for where it comes from. And what is the Bible's answer for all 6 of these? God. Now, that could be a complete coincidence. I don't know. I actually stumbled upon that as I was getting ready to teach this to some high schoolers and found it all in 3 verses. I had heard the first 3, but then when I wrote them all down, I was amazed that the next 3 come in verses 3 and 4. We got all 6. So, can we keep God out of our science? Well, you can try, but you're going to be stuck. The laws of science themselves make you stuck. The Bible fills every gap that science leaves open in the first 4 sentences. All right, my brain's a little full again. We're going to take another break. Here's what you're going to do in your group. Same 2 questions. what was the most useful thing you learned in that session that you want to remember, something you want to hold on to? Second, what's the most important question you want to ask when we get to Q&A? All right? Your brains are full. You need to dump it out by talking together a little bit. Okay. Raise your hand, any group that wrote down the most important thing you learned is glasses plus bald equals smart. There were big prizes. I just want you to know what you missed out on. Okay. All right, now we are in part 3. We're in part 3. What you're going to do this time, we found right there in the first 4 verses of the Bible something that was intriguing and that it answered some very big scientific questions. In fact, the biggest ones in the greatest cosmology, and it answered them all with God. But my next question is, what about the whole rest of the Bible? Remember, I told you the Bible is not specifically a science book. It doesn't read like a science book. It doesn't attempt to explain biology. It does touch on scientific matters, but you would think the Bible being written between 2 and 3 plus thousand years ago, and by a whole bunch of different authors over great different time periods, you would think that the science would kind of be all over the place when it touches on it, right? If you just took a bunch of writings from various periods of time historically, you get a lot of weird science that changes and morphs over time. That's what you would expect. So let's see what the Bible does give us. Are there some science questions that come up in the Bible? Now, there's a lot to this that I'm not going to get into. History and archaeology matching up with the Bible. There's all kinds of stuff with that. I'm not going to get into the details. I'm not going to touch on that one. But what I will do is we're going to take you to a few verses. So if you want, I'd really like you to see them in your Bible. Again, I thought I could put them up here and you could just see them all, but I'd like you to be able to find them and see them. So if you got a Bible to click, or if you have a Bible to open, either one, if you can. Otherwise, I'll read it for you, or you can just lean over the person next to you and invade their private space. Okay, the first one I want you to see is Isaiah 40:22. Isaiah 40:22. Isaiah 40:22 says this. He, referring to God, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. Okay, that's Isaiah 40:22. Now, that does not specifically claim to be a scientific statement, but it does say a couple of very interesting things. It describes the circle of the earth. There's another verse in Psalms that does the same thing. The word circle there is the same word in Hebrew. It could be translated as sphere. The sphere of the earth. Now, does it describe that the earth is a sphere and make a scientific claim? No, but it is interesting. It doesn't prove that the Bible is right scientifically, but it doesn't hurt either. And it's also interesting that it describes, and many verses describe, God stretching the heavens. More recently, we've discovered that all of the galaxies are stretching apart. The universe is actually stretching out. The Bible consistently describes the heavens as being stretched out by God. Now, I also have to note, and it should be conceded, when you get an argument, or if you do debate, anybody who do debate class, learn debate class, one of the important things you got to learn in debate class is the importance of conceding, recognizing when the other person is right about some things. Otherwise, you sound like the arrogant one. And even if you are the smartest and all the right things to say, nobody wants to listen to you. It should be conceded that atheists argue that other verses, like Ecclesiastes 1, speak of the sun rising and setting and going on its circuit, which appears to talk about the sun going around the earth. And for centuries, the church interpreted that as meaning the earth is in the center and the sun goes around. Because that's kind of what it looks like. If you just observe naturally that the sun goes up and around, it's understandable that for centuries people thought the sun went around the earth. In fact, atheists will additionally point out that the church kicked Galileo out and all kinds of trouble with Copernicus when they started figuring out that the earth goes around the sun, and they kicked them out of the church because they said, you're disagreeing with the Bible, and the Bible is right. And they pointed to verses like Ecclesiastes 1, see, the sun goes around the earth. Should concede that matter. However, The verse in Ecclesiastes 1 describes the sun coming up and going down. Does the sun do that? From our perspective, yes. And even scientifically, a matter of perspective counts. And it is true that the sun goes in a circuit around through the sky. And if you want an even deeper argument, it's interesting that the sun, in fact, has a circuit that it circles through the universe. Our whole solar system is to go in a circuit through our galaxy, through the Milky Way galaxy. That's actually running a circuit. So, technically, if you want to be really scientific about those words, there's actually a way to make them right accurately. I think Solomon was just looking and saying, the sun goes up and comes down, and there's nothing wrong with that. It was just observable. And others will, next one. Turn to Job 26. Turn to Job 26. This one is about where the earth is. Now, as you're turning to Job 26, I'll point out that ancient cultures had a lot of explanations for how the earth stood, right? Or how it didn't fall, because in our immediate observation, everything falls. So why doesn't the earth below us fall? And explanations were everything from Atlas holding up the earth, right? Atlas holds up the earth so it doesn't fall. What he's standing on was not quite clear. Other cultures believe that the earth was held up by a turtle, and or various other animals holding up the earth, or some explanation of that. But interesting, Job 26:7 says, speaking of God again, he spreads out the northern skies. There's that stretching again. Over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. He suspends the earth over nothing. That's pretty interesting. What do we know from sending satellites into space about the earth? That it's round, it's spherical, and it hangs over nothing. Now, flat earthers, I'm very sorry. Very, very sorry. And I actually say that with a little bit of humility. There was a brand new believer in the church who came to me and asked me, who had looked up the word firmament, because she was reading a King James version of the Bible. It said firmament. She wanted to know what it meant. When she looked it up, it showed a picture of a flat earth with a firmament above it. And she thought, oh, I guess the Bible teaches that the earth is flat and this firmament, and she thought maybe that's scientifically true. And she started asking me. She knew I knew some science, and she was asking me, showed me the picture, is the earth really flat? And I'd say, no. And some of that stuff is on the internet to troll Christians. When you search for certain things, it's there to troll Christians who don't know better, to help you, to try to convince you that the Bible says all kinds of wrong things about science. So, it says the earth hangs on nothing. Again, needs to be conceded that several other verses speak of the pillars or foundations of the earth. And so an atheist would argue with you, well, wait, one verse says the earth hangs on nothing. Another verse talks about pillars of the earth or foundations of the earth. So the Bible just says both of them. You just claim the one that's right and ignore the one that's wrong. Well, again, to point out that the earth does have foundations. Even spherically, it has a center, the crust, and everything below us is still foundations for the earth. And either way, the Bible was not attempting to describe the full solar system and the way it all works. But technically, you can see foundations. Yes, there are foundations of the earth. It hangs on nothing. Yes, it hangs on nothing. All right, next one. Genesis 15:5. Genesis 15:5. Go back there. Now, this one's talking about how many stars there are. And I should point out, as you turn your way to Genesis 15, that historically, for centuries and millennia, it was believed that the stars were about how many you could count in the sky with the naked eye. Before telescopes, many astrologers and astronomers, etc., tried to count the stars, and generally you can count like 1,100 stars or so. You can only see so many. You ever been out in the desert where it's completely dark? Or way out on the water on a ship somewhere, and the lights go out, and it's just phenomenal. Man, that should put the fear of God in you. So cool. But there's always seemed to be a finite number of stars. In verse 5, Genesis 15:5, he took him outside and said, this is the Lord speaking to Abraham, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. It makes basically a reference that the stars are uncountable. He doesn't tell Abraham you're going to have 1,100 descendants. He said it's going to be uncountable. So again, and the stars, there are some estimates of how many there are, but we got millions times billions. melts your brain when you start thinking about how many stars there actually are, and it's incredibly cool. But you could spend your entire lifetime counting. Yes, there are a finite number. There have to be. Infinity is impossible. But you could spend your whole lifetime counting. So when God says, if it were possible to count, that's accurate. It is impossible for a human to count the stars. All right. 2 Samuel 22. Actually, I want you to skip. Sorry, you're in Genesis. Stay in Genesis. Oh, I can't do all of these. So let's Genesis 7. Go to Genesis 7. In the Genesis 7:11. 7:11. Easy to remember. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. It talks about the springs of the great deep. What that's describing is great deep, like down deep in the oceans, that there are springs of water. Now, without modern submersibles and submarines and modern equipment, how would you know that the ocean actually has springs of water? Well, in fact, it does. We know from very recent times that there are great springs underwater. In fact, you ever watch like some of the science stuff of the kind of life that exists down on those? It's incredibly hot because it's all hot. The water is heated up by the magma down underneath it. And bacteria can live in conditions that were previously considered impossible for anything to live. And it's so incredibly cool. But there are springs of the great deep, which is exactly what it describes right there. Again, it doesn't prove the Bible is right, but it doesn't hurt. It makes a scientific kind of statement, and it's accurate to this day. And it was only recognized as accurate in the last couple centuries. Okay, this one is actually pretty cool. Turn to Psalm verse 8. And this one comes with a little story before we take our next break. Psalm verse 8, Psalm chapter 8, and I'm going to skip my way through. I'm going to start at verse 1. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And then later, verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place. You made man ruler. Now this is verse 6, I think. You made man ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet. And then later in verse 8, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and this is the important part, Psalm 8:8, all that swim the paths of the seas. All that swim the paths of the seas. Now this one comes with a story. What does paths of the seas describe? Now, birds take paths around the seas. They have patterns, but do the seas themselves have paths? Well, interesting. Back in 1841, a U.S. naval officer named Matthew Maury had suffered an injury which forced his retirement. He was placed in charge of the Depot of Charts and Instruments of the Hydrographic Office of the Navy between 1841 and 1861. He was a Christian. Okay, so you got a Navy officer who is in charge of all the charts that the Navy keeps of the oceans and the seas. He was a Christian who loved the Word of God. One day he was reading Psalm 8, this very same thing that we read. He was struck by verse 8. He read that God had given man dominion over the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the seas. He immediately decided that if the Bible says there are paths of the seas, that there must be paths of the seas. He dedicated himself to figure out where these paths are. Now, ships were coming back and forth between Europe and America, but they had not yet discovered that there are, in fact, ways that you can go where the waters will take you, because today we know that there are cycles, there are paths that the seas take. So if you put your boat in one way, the ocean will actually help you get to the other side, and put it down another place, it'll help you get the other way. Nobody knew that until Matthew Maury found it. He found it because he was a Christian, and he read Psalm 8 and said, if God says they're there, then they must be there. Matthew Maury is still celebrated to this day for being the discoverer of the paths of the seas. He created charts, and other naval officers helped him create more charts, and he discovered the paths of the seas. Now, did God intend for that to be? You could say paths of the seas could have meant anything. Could have just meant the way fish go here and there. So does it prove the Bible is right scientifically? No, but it doesn't hurt. And it's pretty cool that a Christian who trusted the Bible staked a whole lot of work on it and found something that to this day is one of the most important things that the Navy and other seafarers use. All the cargo ships follow the paths of the seas. All right, there's a few more that I won't go into all of them. I won't have you turn around because we're going to run out of time, but I'll tell you just a couple others in Job 26, Job 36, and Ecclesiastes 1. All three of those describe a circulation of waters, not around the seas, but in the water cycle. I'll read Ecclesiastes 1, verse 60. You don't have to turn there, but Ecclesiastes 1 says, "The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course." That's actually describing wind cycles, which are also discovered more recently. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Observation that water keeps going into the sea. If you follow the rivers, they're coming from the mountains, all the snow melts, and it forms the rivers, and the rivers end up in the seas. Why doesn't the sea just slowly fill up and up and up? It says the water returns to where it came from. Now, it doesn't describe the evaporation and the rain and the whole cycle, but it is accurate. And the interesting thing is, scientists didn't catch up with that until the 1700s. The water cycle is relatively recent in our understanding. Again, it's not a science book, but it's scientifically accurate. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with some more to consider. So we're going to take a break before we fill our heads with anything else. The main thing I wanted to show you there is not that the Bible is a science book, but the Bible claims to be a book of truth. And if we test the Bible using science, the Bible actually passes, pretty incredibly, a lot of scientific tests. Now, we haven't asked every question, but we got a few big ones in there, and that's pretty impressive. Does it prove the Bible? No, but it doesn't disprove the Bible. And it supports it in some pretty incredible ways that other religious texts and other ancient texts cannot hold up to. So, group time again, because we got question and answer coming up pretty soon. So before we get to that, you got 4 minutes once again. And this time, actually, I'm going to give you a couple extra minutes before we do Q&A. I want you to stand and stretch this time because you've been sitting for a while and your brains are going to stop working. So this is your moment to stand and stretch. I'll give you a couple extra minutes if you got to use the bathroom, whatever you need to do. But I still want you to think about, come back together and think about what's the most important thing you learned? And what question do you have about it so we can get to our Q&A? Okay. If you didn't get to discuss it, at least write down your own. Make sure you got your question, because we're going to do a question and answer just a bit. I'm going to close out, kind of summarize what I've done, and then we're taking some questions before we finish things up. So, oh man, how am I supposed to look smart? Oh, there we go. Okay, now you can trust me. Now you know. Very important. You don't clap too much. Remember, glasses plus bald, yes, that's two things, too important. Okay, I want to close up and read a verse in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1. Romans 1, beginning at verse 18. Romans delivers the heart of the gospel. So actually, if you ask me, my favorite chapter that I ever taught in all through the Word, Romans 1, 2, and 3 was my favorite section to teach. That's why, if you listen to Romans 1, it's actually like 12 minutes. It's supposed to be 8 minutes. That's so long. But I really enjoy doing Romans 1, 2, and 3. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Verse 19. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. People are without excuse. Now, emphasize that because that convicted me personally. I spent years calling myself agnostic, claiming that nobody could prove God, resting on the science I heard in class, but I never really tried to prove God. what I really had, what it came down to was an excuse. In my mind, somewhere in the back of my mind, I kind of pictured if ever I died and there was like a judgment day thing that happened and God challenged me, pull out this card like agnostic. I didn't know, you didn't prove it, it's my get out of jail free card. And I didn't articulate that, but that was kind of the truth behind my feelings. But here it says people are without excuse. There is no excuse that gets you out of it. And atheists and those who claim that there is no God will present the idea that maybe science has explained the universe sufficiently so that you don't need God to fill in the gaps. Maybe there is a God, but you don't have to have a God. You can have a version of the universe without God. What did we come up with? We had 6 major issues between the Big Bang and evolution that neither of them explained. And Genesis 1 through 4 answered all 6. It's pretty amazing. But I also say that with a little bit of compassion here. I was a brand new believer, and I got in a discussion with a friend of mine. He was working on his PhD in information compression. PhD in information compression. He was working in aerospace. In other words, making information smaller and smaller and smaller, which is incredible stuff. I didn't realize it at the time, but the stuff he was working on are the reason that we have these, right? I remember when I saw the first ad, anybody old enough to remember the first iPod ad when they said 1,000 songs in one device? I was like, oh, the world has changed. That's information compression. Did you know that DNA compresses information 1 trillion times more than the most advanced information compression in the world? Information compression is like the leading edge of science because you got to make things smaller to make these suckers work and to get stuff out of space. Like the smartest guys in the world, my buddy was smart. The smartest people in the world work on making stuff smaller. Did you know that DNA is so small and the amount of information it packs in, it loops and ties. DNA isn't just a big long strand. It loops together and it packs 1 trillion times smaller than the most advanced information compression that scientists have been spending decades on. You think DNA did that by accident? And the thing is, that's step 1. That just started with an accident. It's pretty amazing stuff. So I was in a discussion with my buddy. I'm a brand new believer, and I got all this evidence for God. And we're going science. I had science for that. And we're sitting over dinner, and it was 2 hours went by, and it's all this. And I'm like, how come he doesn't get it? Why is this not getting through? I have the upper hand on all of this. I can prove God. He's sleeping on a bed of lies. He finally tells me his parents were in church. In fact, they were leaders in church. He grew up as a little kid. They were in church. His mom was a choir director, and his dad was some other leadership role in church. And and when he was about 10 years old or so, his parents got divorced. And he asked God why, and God didn't answer. And he was done with God. And he spent 2 or 3 hours arguing with me over science, but it was not the issue. He was mad at God. And it was easier for him to deal with a universe where God didn't do this to him, or God where everything's just an accident. That was just easier to deal with. It's not always about the science argument, right? Those arguments are important, but if you come across as arrogant with somebody who's got some deep hurts, they're not going to tell you those things. They're just going to keep arguing back on whatever comes at you. But if you come across with some love and compassion, right? Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Make sure you answer the questions that really matter to the person you're talking to. And if it's you, if you're the one struggling with that, make sure you ask the questions that really matter. Because you can tie yourself in that science debate forever, pretending like that's your real issue. But God has made himself known. The reality is we live in a difficult world, and explaining the way things are is not as simple as God did it. Well, if God did it, how come my life is so messed up? Those are really valid questions. And the Bible deals with a lot of those. We're not going to get into all that. But you got to honor the reality of that. We actually just launched a new podcast that we're going to do a series on called the Soul Podcast, S-O-L-E. We're actually going to do a series on science and the Bible. But one of our rules that we have when we do the Soul Podcast, we always tell somebody's story first. Because when you talk story, when you tell your story, people tend to put down their guard. If you start with an argument, if you start with science and you don't get to know the person, they'll just put up their guard. And they'll put up their arguments whether they make sense or not. Story first. Get to know somebody. Have some compassion. Okay, I wanted to do that, but I want to do your Q&A. We're going to do Q&A. I'm going to ask your question a little bit. You've been collecting your best questions. First of all, I want to point out that I do not have all the answers. And I will admit that freely. When you get in a discussion with somebody else, you got to admit to them, I don't know all the answers. I don't know, but I see a lot of evidence for God and a lot of cool stuff in the Bible. There's stuff in the Bible I don't know how to answer, but there's enough in here for me to believe in him. So let's do a little bit of question and answer, and the tables should have been collecting. Now, I know Hannah asked a question, so I'm going to let you go first to make sure you get your question. Hannah wrote down a question for me. Pastor Marcel's got a microphone for you to ask your question.
If random cannot be proved, how do evolutionists answer that?
That is a very good question. If randomness, thank you, Hannah. What does your shirt say again? Science rules. Nice. If randomness can't be proven, how do evolutionists get past that? Well, for the most part, what you get in school is they don't address the question. Most scientists or in school or whatever will keep giving more and more evidence for other parts. Look, evidence of mutations, evidence of lots of time, evidence of natural selection. And they, for the most part, don't address that. Most Christians actually don't know to ask that question, that random is really the issue. So I will actually, from that question, I want to give you a recommendation. I've tried reading different books on evolution. I'm not a pro. There's some great groups out there. Institute for Creation Research is ICR. There are some other groups. Answers in Genesis is another one. I have some issues with how each of them goes. I read a great book from ICR I was reading, but the first issue that they were all about was it's a young earth. That's the first thing they want to prove. And I kind of had an issue with that. Like, their first argument is against other Christians? Shouldn't the first argument just be to take on the general, like the stuff I told you about? There's some really easy arguments about randomness, about entropy, order and time and space and all mass and energy and all these things. Why are we going to prove first thing younger? But there's also some really great stuff in this. Whatever you read, read it with balance. All right. One new book that I just read recently, I don't agree with everything in it, but I really enjoy it. This one's called Evolution 2.0, Perry Marshall. This one was fascinating to me. The guy who wrote it, Perry Marshall, is a software engineer, not a biologist, software engineer. He really focuses a lot on that need for code, and it's really fascinating. He also focuses a lot on all the evidence that there is of evolution, and there's some really amazing stuff. Parts of evolution that we didn't learn in school, some elements like that cells actually rearrange their own DNA. It's called transposition. They'll rearrange parts of their DNA to respond to outside elements, which can actually lead to but it's not like dying and survival of the fittest. It actually, within one lifetime, actually evolving to respond to the outside. Also, epigenetics is a part of evolution that doesn't get taught much, where a cell will turn off and on sections of its DNA code to respond to some outside need. It'll turn on a section of code and use this one and turn off another, and can actually pass that on to the next generation. It's all very purposeful. There's a bunch of other stuff in here I recommend, but what it really adds up to is that the random thing really doesn't have scientific backing, but purposeful. There's a lot of evolution and evidence of evolution that looks extremely purposeful. Now, it's still just bacteria becoming bacteria, and, cats becoming cats and dogs becoming dogs, but purposeful evolution is actually really fascinating to think about. So, little tip, I won't go into all the details I could, but it's a really interesting one, Evolution 2.0. Okay, I want another question. You wrote, your whole assignment was to write down questions. So you have to have one. So somebody raise their hand if they'd like to. We got a question back there. Marcel will bring you. I see a very hesitant hand. Okay.
If there's order, then why are there things that, and I'm thinking outside of what a friend might ask me.
Yeah.
If there is order, then why are there things such as, perhaps a person that might be born disabled, or problems in the world.
Okay, excellent question. If there is order, then why are bad things happening? So there's a deeper theological question there, of course, why are people suffering? But it is very interesting to note that many of the birth defects that we're aware of come from mutations in DNA that are bad, right? That when bad things... And the reality is this: if you randomly change someone's DNA, every time that we have like evidence of something bad, like randomly changing, it's mostly really bad stuff happening. So if you think about how does evolution act, what if it's happening right now? How is it happening right now? If you just randomly change DNA, what are the odds that you're actually going to get a positive? There should be some positive effects, some negative effects. It wouldn't just be all good, nothing, or positive. Think of DNA mutations. Think of it like, and the book describes it well like this. If it's just code, if you go to somebody programming code and say, hey, what if I just switch sections of your code? What if I just monkey with it? What's the probability that his software program will improve? Just randomly. What if I just take the words in a book and I just mix a few of them around? What are the probability it's going to get better? Actually a better analogy of what it's really like, what if you took like a CD or a DVD and just scratched it to mess up the code? What are the odds that you're going to improve the movie? Well, there's some movies that... But that's really what that idea is like. But why do bad things happen? Well, God allows bad things to happen. And you could answer because there's sin in the world, but if they don't want the Bible argument, like, the truth is that no matter what your cosmology, whether it came from God or it came from evolution, bad things happen, and that's rough to deal with, right? When babies suffer, that's hard to deal with. And so, number one, I just answer that question, first of all, with compassion, and say, I don't know. I had twin older brothers who were stillborn. I don't know why. And I get discussion. My mom's not a believer, and I'll get discussions forever with her, and she will forever come back to we'll have long discussions, ask all kind of questions. We'll always come back to, well, what about your brothers? And because it's incredibly hard to have stillborn kids, or to go through a miscarriage, or people go through hard things. So any questions like that, just acknowledge first with compassion, and that you don't know. I mean, I could give, like, you could try a scientific answer for why God allows it, but just have compassion for him. Okay, let's do another question. You have to have them. That was your whole assignment. I'm taking back gold stars if I ask a question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? That is a good question. What do you think? Anybody got an answer to that one? A chicken or an egg? I don't know. I would go with chicken, is my guess. From the way the Bible describes it, it appears that God made adults, and then the adults had kids, rather than God making eggs that then matured. But it doesn't actually say that. It just said God made all the birds, but he could go with one or the other. But that's actually a fantastic larger question. Like, you keep going back, at what point did eggs just suddenly start happening? Yes?
One of the questions that I've been asked, or even some of my students and some of the kids that I've been seeing, is that, what about the cavemen and all these other humans that there were before and everything like that?
Okay, excellent question. When you learn evolution, you usually learn about cavemen. And you learn about a whole series of mankind, or if you walk around the Smithsonian and you see the evolution display, and you'll see stages from Lucy the monkey to that made the apes made their way to humans. Okay, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm going to answer in general answers, which is pretty much what you would probably do. The first thing to recognize there, when I was in school, I remember 5th grade, we learned the evolution of the horse. And there were all these elements of the horse, and it just made sense. They show all this stuff. And they described evolution. And I remember thinking to myself, well, there's probably like fields full of bones of there had to be millions of these stages of the horse for it to happen, right? And I remember learning some years later that a lot of the pictures that you get of the horses evolving are scientific theories on those steps, or maybe the various stages of man, the little guy and the bigger guy and the bigger guy getting taller. I thought there was like, Piltdown Man was like a whole millions of them that we got all these bones for. The reality is all of those are based on a few precious bones, right? Lucy was a very important find because it was one monkey that had more bones than usual. And in fact, but Lucy was actually not all the bones. And you go to Smithsonian, they'll show you the parts of the bones they have. That doesn't nullify their whole methodology. It's just a reality check to understand that the evolutionary history is based on a very small set of scattered data. For the most part, bones don't survive for forever and ever. That we don't have all this evidence, but we build on a small set of evidence. The reality is that there's some evidence of cavemen look different from us. But the Bible doesn't have a problem with there being different shapes of heads or shoulders or changes. And for me, I think that small evolution would explain why you get darker skin or lighter skin in one place. But my theory on it generally is the original DNA it actually had all the information necessary for all the skin colors, all the different like heights and everything that you might need to survive in a different area. And adaptation happened amazingly, and we all came about from that. Did some ancient people look different? Have you ever seen a person that looked really significantly different from you? I mean, bone structure and jaw and like really significantly different walking around today. Yeah, they're around, and God bless them. They're every single one made in God's image. Absolutely. Right? We judge based on those differences, but God tells us to love everyone made in God's image. The assumptions there's a lot of assumptions that go into the primitiveness of those peoples, right? That we don't necessarily have evidence. The stuff that survives in a cave, right? Because caves protect things. So we make a lot of assumptions. Well, this is the whole way they live. Well, there could be all kinds of stuff that was happening out in the field that's just all gone now. Now, I'm not a science, I don't study that science in detail, right? So I say that full admission, like I'm not going to give you complete answers. It's just good to know that science isn't complete. And you can read stuff, you can go on to like ICR, their webpage, or Answers in Genesis, their webpage, and they'll actually show you a lot of where some of those stages of humans came from. Some of them have been debunked. Some of those pictures you see of different men have been debunked. The bones that they used to say this is a thing were not actually human bones. Like some were absolutely, this was an ape, and some of them, there was one that used a pig tooth to develop in the jaw of a human. They make a lot of assumptions on a few little bones. I don't know all the details, but I don't really need those answers personally to be okay with God just made humans, and they don't look exactly the same today as they did back then. Okay, question, and we got to finish up. I'll take a couple more. Right.
So why is it still being taught in schools?
Okay, so why is it being taught in schools? So interestingly, that argument, as far as I know, did not come up in the school board argument. It's actually really interesting to me. Again, I think Christians, we often focus on the wrong arguments. If we focus on the time argument, try to prove that the earth is 6,000 years old. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about the flood that would demonstrate, and it's really, you can do some simple math and show that the population from about 4,200 years ago, if you start with 8 people 4,200 years ago, you use 0.5% annual population growth, which is actually pretty conservative, you'd end up with 8 billion people today. Like, that actually matches, you learn that math, it's A equals PE to the RT, if you remember a little bit of statistics from pre-calculus, the APERT equation. Like 8 people to 8 billion people actually fits the timeline. About 4,200 or so years is actually a good fit. But we get lost in those arguments, and the argument that they make is actually pretty good. God can't be scientifically proven, so why do you put it in science class? Okay, yeah, that's logical. But unfortunately, we missed the random argument, which is a really easy one. I started with that because it's a great way to just like, if you start a conversation, to start with like, oh, wait a second, we both have a problem, right? admit, like, yeah, I rely on the God thing, and I can't, like, prove that absolutely, but hey, what about this one? You can't prove random. So we're actually kind of both in the same boat here. So let's try to figure this out and humble ourselves and realize that there is no 100% proof. I can prove the way everything started from the speck to this, or from the nothing to the universe to the life to now. There's an important verse, Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the hidden things belong to God. Deuteronomy 29:29. The hidden things belong to God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children, so that we may live them. I may have slightly misquoted it. I think it goes something like that. But it's a beautiful verse acknowledging there are things we don't know. Like sometimes I don't know exactly what a verse is. But the hidden things belong to God. I don't know. Like when somebody challenges and you don't know, you're like, I don't know. That's a really good question. Okay, one last question. Oh, I got two people just raised their hand. Okay, two last questions, but I'll make my answers quick. First behind you, all the way in the back.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, my question is, there's a lot of evidence that dinosaurs existed. There's even some verses that you can read that will point evidence to the fact that dinosaurs did exist, in addition to the fossils that we find today. So my question is, if dinosaurs were real, there's evidence of them, they're no longer here because a big meteor destroyed the entire Earth and there's no more dinosaurs left. Given the fact that humans were created by man, by God, as well as dinosaurs, why did humans survive that meteor and dinosaurs didn't?
Excellent question. Okay, so dinosaurs existed. The Bible has nothing against dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are awesome. And I feel like we kind of missed out. So, okay, the dinosaur question is one of the more fascinating elements of biblical timelines. But again, there are Christians on both sides. There are Christians who say dinosaurs and humans absolutely existed at the same time. It's really fascinating stuff. I watch the stuff from like ICR and Answers in Genesis, and they show some evidence that looks like humans exist alongside dinosaurs. A lot of historically what people described as dragons throughout history. For most of history, these were not descriptions of mythological beasts. They were just descriptions of really scary creatures. And so there are people who think that the history of dragons from China to Europe to other places was actually people describing dragons. Again, for those arguments, I would say I get over my head because I don't actually know the details, so I don't camp there. I would say I'm okay if dinosaurs came first. If you got an older theory where you want dinosaurs for a long time, it would have to be biblically the same day as man, era, over millions of years. The hardest question biblically about that question, the hardest part of that, is the existence of death before the fall. That's really biblically. We've been mostly focusing on the science. We haven't dug into the Bible question. The heart of the question for biblically whether dinosaurs and other creatures exist alongside humans is, in the biblical account, man was created, then the sin came, and then death happens. The challenge there that you could go either way biblically on is it only specifically says that's how death came to humans. The verse in Romans 5 speaks of when Adam sinned, death came into the world. A lot of young earth creationists will point to that and say death could not have existed before the fall, therefore all living things must have existed at the same time. However, that's reading into it a little bit, because you could still be biblically faithful. Some try. I'm not saying which one I'm agreeing with. I'm just saying there are people who are biblically faithful and say death may have existed in the animal world. God may have created that, and that was part of God's cycle of life that he created, but it would not have touched humans until the fall. Some people would call that heresy and say that's absolutely unbiblical, but it all rests on one verse. I think it's Romans 5, maybe 12. I'm not sure. It's Romans 5, that the death came through one man. But the verse really seems to be focusing on mankind. I'm not making a claim either way. I'm not the mega Bible scholar. I'm just good at explaining it to you so you understand what the debate is. But again, at least you don't have to win that argument in order to be okay with the Bible. right? It would be, I hope the dinosaurs were around with humans, because I just think that's really cool. And I could show you on the internet some evidence one way, but then somebody else could probably show it the other way, and I would get lost, and they'd start lobbing stuff over my head, and I'd be like, okay, I'm still good with God and good with science, and you guys go at it. Okay, last question was right here, and then I got to let you go.
It kind of struck, the question struck from hearing the conversation over here. So, and again, it's almost kind of a good wrap up in my opinion. So I'm gonna say it now. So being a former educator, and then
Me too.
having the conversation right now. What advice? And I'm so glad that I'm seeing so many young people in the audience right now.
Yeah.
Because these are conversations that we never had as kids. Well, I can say I never had as a kid. I had questions, but didn't know who to turn to. And as parents, even tonight in our conversation from you, it's interesting hearing their takeaways to further conversation later on. But what advice would you give them, knowing that evolution is taught in schools, in response to their teachers, in response to friends, how to articulate it in a way that, because you know the stigma or the black cloud over you as being that Christian, and then you're all of a sudden you're failing a class or something, and I know it happens, right? But what advice would you give to somebody who's, to parents or for kids who are listening right now, how to stay true to your belief, but also honor the fact that this is the curriculum that that's teaching is mandated we learn right now?
All right, that is a fantastic question for us to close out. So you're in school, and you're getting evolution, and you kind of feel like the odd man out, like, I don't actually believe this stuff, but I don't know enough about it to stand up for it, and you don't want to get picked on. So a couple of and this kind of goes for everybody if it comes up somewhere. Number one, you want to recognize that as others might look at you, oh, you're the Christian, and you're probably against all this stuff, you're anti-science. It's really important to recognize that first and say, I'm not anti-science. I'm actually not anti-evolution necessarily. I just have science questions about it that I don't have all the answers for. And I made this, most of what I did in the first 2 sessions was all science. I just okay, let's put the God stuff over the side for a second and focus, but I have some science questions. Does evolution answer this? Does evolution answer where mass came from, where time came from, where space came from? Does it answer where order came from, or where energy came from? What was my last one? Code, where code comes from. So, first advice to you, don't make it an argument between you and the teacher. Don't make it an argument between you and a friend, right? Otherwise, they're going to read it as you're arguing Bible versus science, right? And remember, that's not the case. It's not Bible versus science. We're all trying to use science as a method to figure out, is the Bible valid? Is this evolution valid? Which one is the best explanation? Also, it's great to make common ground first. That's why I really wanted to emphasize there's a lot of things about evolution that I'm fine with, the Bible is fine with, and are pretty stinking amazing, right? Adaptation is phenomenal stuff. If you dig into watching what bacteria actually do and how it all works, it's really cool. Is it an explanation for how monkeys became humans? That seems like a big stretch to me. Is it an explanation for how wolves became whales? Or was it the other way around? Whales become wolves? I don't know. That's kind of a stretch. And so make common ground. Hey, evolution's really cool, but I don't see where mass came from, where space came from, where order came from, like that. These are basic laws of science that aren't answered. And when you get into the details, I'm going to read you from this is from a biology book. One of my students actually, he quotes it in this book, but one of my students, I was tutoring biology, and this quote was in their book about the origin of life. High school biology book says, in the laboratory, illuminated iron sulfide particles suspended in solution with an electron donor and carbon dioxide behave like photoelectric cells. When this or similar source of photochemical energy in membrane-bounded cells converted carbon dioxide and nitrogen to organic compounds, the biological revolution began. How much of that do you understand? You know what it just said? Chemistry, 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 physics, physics, life. That's basically what it said. It just happened and then. So the big question is like, wait, slow it down. Did you actually explain how all this happened? If you like slow down and stretch out any of the evolutionary steps, they start becoming nonsense. Like the steps of, okay, if you got apes that are going to become humans, and apes have like 6 kids, how many kids are they going to have? And you just like randomly change their DNA. How many of those are going to be better? Well, like 1 in a million. Like it should be 0. There's no evidence that changing code makes it better. Give 1 in a million. Well, if you only got 1 in a million and you got like 10 in a generation, those are all worse. 10 in another generation, they're all worse. How many apes are you going to get until one of them is better? Is that going to evolve? Like when you slow evolution down to like generation by generation, it starts turning into nonsense, right? You're just mixing up code. Like try that with a software programmer. I'm just going to keep mixing up your code. One of these days it's going to work. So, but don't be a pest about it. Don't be arguing about it. Just point out like, hey, there's questions I don't think we have answered. But also acknowledge humbly, hey, there's questions I can't answer about life. But God sure helps me out. God sure seems to be a better explanation than nothing becoming something. How come apes aren't turning into humans today? It's a fine question. And, all right, there's a lot of other good questions. It's Friday night. Yeah, it is a great comment. When you make those kind of comments in class, like it's not you against your teacher. Your teacher works hard. Don't make their life more difficult. Like, I've been a teacher. You don't need a pesky Christian kid giving you a hard time. Pastor Kris said, random can't be proven. Zing! Like, no, just ask genuine, like, I want to know science. Can you prove the random part of it? Say, if there's the answer's no, okay. Okay, we got to close with that. I'm going to pray. Thank you, Lord, for our time together. Thank you for teaching us truth. Lord, we humbly approach you and seek truth. Help us, Lord, to use science for the beautiful things that you made it for. Help us to trust in your word for the incredible truth that it speaks to us, Lord, that we are made in your image and we are loved. And there's a lot of things about this world that we can't explain, we don't understand. But, Lord, the things we do, we understand you love us. We understand you sent your son to die for us that we could be forgiven. Even when we turn against you and turn science into an idol, Lord, even as I did that, you brought forgiveness through your gospel, salvation as Jesus poured out his blood, that I might be forgiven, that we all might be forgiven. Lord, we put our trust in you. Help us to stand up for truth. Help us, Lord, to do it in a way that's compassionate, faithful, and humble. Lord, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Everybody said? Amen. Thanks, everybody. I'll stick around for questions.